The tuxedo never left the closet. The truth finally did. I remember asking Walker casually over my morning coffee, "So, when's the wedding?" and watching the room go quiet. Gianna's voice came from the other side of the house like a thrown stone. "Oh, we got married yesterday, and only special people were invited." Those 6 words struck me like a verdict. They were not casual. They were a sentence. Before we dive in, tell me where you're watching from and drop your take in the comments as you watch. Share your reaction, opinions, and what you think really happened. I read them all. We'll be giving shoutouts to standout comments and videos in the next upload, so make sure yours counts. I am Adam Brooks. I am 71, a widower, and I had believed all my life that love was proven by sacrifice. I had laid my wife's memory on the altar of my son's future. For 4 years I poured what I thought was comfort into Walker and Gianna's life. Monthly support that added up to $6,500 in rent alone each month, money for a wedding dress, the hall, furniture. In total more than $54,800. I paid what I thought a father ought to pay, and I paid with the quiet pride of a man carrying his late wife's intent. When Gianna said only special people, she meant something I had not imagined. She had excluded me. I found their photographs the same night on social media. Gianna laughing under an arch of flowers, Walker's face lit with pleasure, the table laden with food. There I was absent. My tuxedo, which I had bought for their wedding, hung unused in the back of my wardrobe like an accusation. It is an ugly thing to be left out of your child's celebration. It is worse to realize the exclusion is deliberate. My chest tightened with humiliation and confusion. How could the boy I taught to ride a bike sign a paper that said I was not welcome at his wedding? The humiliation felt like a public stripping of dignity. I had been reduced to a bank account, not a father. At first I thought it was a lapse, a miscommunication that hurt but would be mended. But the more I scrolled, the stranger it became. Captions thanked family and close friends. There was a picture where Gianna's mother raised a glass with the caption, "Never felt more blessed." No one, not a single guest, mentioned me. The absence on the screen echoed in my house. My grief for Helen mingled with a new grief. Betrayal. A few days later, Gianna called in a voice sharpened by irritation. "Dad, the rent's overdue. Have you sent it?" The question was ordinary, transactional. I felt my insides twist. I had been their benefactor. Now I was conveniently a benefactor who was supposed to be automatic. I tried to make a joke out of it at first. It came out flat. "Didn't I tell you?" I said, and the words surprised me by their truth. They echoed back the cruelty of her earlier comment. That was the moment something inside me shifted. I understood, with a clarity that felt both terrifying and liberating, that my love had been treated as a commodity. That night I sat at my kitchen table and counted. I had planned for retirement and kept careful ledgers, but the ledger told a different story now. $14,400 had gone to their rent over the years, $6,900 to groceries and incidentals, $4,500 in gifts to keep the peace. The numbers were not just ink. They were evidence of a life redirected to sustain an illusion. Humiliation brought clarity. I felt foolish and furious in equal measure. Rage can be a poison, but it can also be a springboard. I resolved then to stop being a walking ATM for someone who called me not important. I would not let my wife's legacy evaporate into entitlement. The next morning I made an appointment with Maria, my bank branch manager. When I told her I wanted to cancel automatic transfers to Walker and Gianna, she did not blink. "You're doing the right thing, Mr. Brooks," she said. Walking home after the bank, I passed the park where I had once pushed Walker on a swing. He was a boy then, a freckled, stubborn child who scraped his knees and expected me to patch him up. Watching other fathers with their children, I wondered when affection had become so complicated. That evening I opened an old box of letters from Helen and found a photograph of the two of us under the lake house pines, younger and certain. I held it like a relic and felt both terrible loss and a stinging clarity. If love could be bought, then it was never love at all. If self-worth could be traded for convenience, then I had been complicit in my own undoing. The hook that keeps me telling this is simple. True love cannot be purchased, and the first step to freedom is recognizing your own value. When Gianna said only special people, she named the wound. When I answered her with the truth, I named my cure. This is where my story begins, with the moment I refused to be small. I couldn't have known then that this humiliation, this sense of rejection, would become the pivot of my life. The bitter realization of betrayal lit a fire in me. Not revenge, but clarity. I would fight for dignity, reclaim my freedom, and learn to love myself again. That promise, small and stubborn, carried me to the next step and find peace. I did what I had avoided. I searched them online. On social media, Walker and Gianna displayed a life that did not include me. Smiles under floral arches, cakes, and captions about our private day. Gianna's phrase, nearest and dearest, repeated like a taunt. In one photo, her mother raised a glass with a caption about blending families. No one had written my name. The images were more than pictures. They were evidence. I enlarged a photograph of a table and saw a tiny florist's card tucked in the centerpiece. A comment tagged a local rental company. Another post showed a new couch with the store tagged. Little breadcrumbs. I felt the humiliation of being erased, and the anger of someone who might have unknowingly funded the scene. Neighbors noticed. Mrs. Lane stopped by with sympathetic eyes and cautious words. Someone in the grocery store mentioned the wedding casually as if I were supposed to know. Their obliviousness became its own mockery. Walker's absence from that invitation felt intentional, not accidental. I tried to imagine where the line had been drawn, when being my son stopped meaning inclusion. I called Walker that night. "Why didn't you invite me?" I asked, steady because rage tastes worse than truth. He said it was small and intimate, that Gianna's family were traditional people and they wanted privacy. It was the old, comfortable excuse. Tradition, timing, logistics. His words were paper-thin. I started cataloging. I dusted off a small notebook Helen and I had used for errands and began writing usernames, dates, store names from the posts. I wrote down times when funds had gone from my account. Patterns emerged. Posts about new furniture and decorations appeared within days of transfers I remembered making. Coincidence could still explain some overlap, but I could not ignore the trail. I rang Owen, an old friend, and told him only what I needed him to know, that I was keeping records and would appreciate a second pair of eyes. He didn't ask questions. He listened and advised me to save everything. Records, he said, are what you hold when feelings are not enough. Evenings, I found myself replaying moments. Walker as a child learning to tie his shoe, his small hands in mine. The image of my tuxedo hanging unused was a private pain I wore publicly. The social wound cut deep. Not only had I been excluded, I had been made invisible. In a world where every private moment can be broadcast, erasure onto the public feed felt like an assault. Still, humiliation brought a strange clarity. Where shock had made me stumble, the posts made me purposeful. If they were curating an image for public consumption, I would use that same evidence in pursuit of truth. I am neither tech-savvy nor theatrical, but I know ledgers and receipts. I would treat the screen not as a mirror of my humiliation but as a source of clues. One afternoon, I printed out 2 pages of posts and pinned them to my kitchen corkboard. Walking past them, the images felt less like slaps and more like a map. I circled vendor tags and screenshot dates. It was a poor man's case file, but it was a start. Evidence, I told myself, is stubborn. Facts do not evaporate under a gloss filter. I began to understand what had been lost. Dignity. Betrayal and humiliation were not theatrical words. They describe how entitlement eats at the core of family. A new lamp in a photo was not just decoration, it was a symbol of assumption, that my money would cover their life. Manipulation can be subtle, staged through filters and friendly comments. I decided to be methodical. I scheduled time with Maria at the bank to request records and to prepare for an accounting. I would not confront Walker in anger. I would confront with facts. Each line I wrote in my little notebook, dates, usernames, vendor tags, felt like a stitch repairing the tear in my confidence. At night, the posts still hurt, but my hurt now had a purpose. Where humiliation had narrowed me, preparation widened me. I would collect proof, keep my dignity and make them answer for what they had done. The call came on a Thursday. I was in the recliner when Gianna's voice, thin with irritation, cut through the quiet. "Dad, the rent's overdue. Have you sent it?" She said it as if it were a simple fact, not the summation of years of my giving. For a moment I felt the old reflex to explain. I thought of dinners I'd paid, groceries I'd left at their door, nights awake worrying about them. Then a different voice inside me replied with simple bluntness. "Didn't I tell you?" The sentence surprised me. When I repeated those words, I heard her logic echoed back. Only special people, and the truth landed. My generosity had been treated as a commodity. The call was not about a bill. It was the moment entitlement named itself. I do not pretend I was composed. I spoke like a man fed up with being taken for granted. "I only help special and important people," I added, because I wanted her to taste her own cruelty reflected. Saying it felt like closing a door I had left ajar. After the call, the house felt very quiet. I imagined their reactions. Sharp retorts, cajoling, threats. But the thought of conflict no longer frightened me the way my silent sacrifice had. I thought instead of the long list of small givens that had become my life. I thought of the tuxedo hanging unused, of photos that showed their life without me. The image hardened my intent. I began to tally, not with bitterness alone but with purpose, to see the ledger behind their comfortable life. I had given over $54,800 in 4 years. Rent, food, gifts. Numbers do not tell the whole story, but they make a trail. It was not only money that had been spent, it was my dignity. The realization of that loss tightened something in me into resolve. I spoke with Owen and the few friends I trusted. Cooper, Logan, Isaac. Men who had known me for years. They did not offer pity. They spoke of records, of rights, of ways to protect one's estate. Elder financial abuse, they said plainly. Naming it made it a battle I could fight. That night I wrote words Helen had taught me to use. Precise and unromantic. Betrayal. Manipulation. Entitlement. Humiliation. Laying these words on paper made the wrong feel less amorphous and more actionable. I cleaned the tuxedo and placed it back in the closet with care. It had been both a symbol of hope and an emblem of my humiliation. I would not let it remain either. The real work would be enforcing the boundary I had named. Saying no was simpler than standing by it. I scheduled time with Maria at the bank to learn where my money had gone. I would not confront Walker and Gianna without facts. Evidence would be my ally. The rent call had been a wound and a turning point. In those few blunt sentences I felt something shift, from a man who quietly paid to a man who would protect his dignity. The phrase I spoke was not spite. It was a vow to guard my savings, my peace, and my self-worth. That vow would carry me forward. I thought of Helen and the careful habit she left me. Folded receipts, labeled envelopes, a ledger she kept in her own hand. Her discipline had once annoyed me. Now it felt like a gift. I dug an old box of papers and began sorting. Bank statements, printed email confirmations, copies of transfers with memos that read for rent, for groceries, help with bills. Seeing the words in black and white turned my vague unease into a clear pattern. There were months when transfers spiked after a bad week, months when my balance dropped so low I wondered how I would manage. It had not been theft in a dramatic sense. It was a slow, steady siphoning, an erosion disguised as help. That detail stung more than any single omission. I called Maria at the bank and asked for a review of account activity. She listened with the steady professionalism of someone who has helped people in worse states than mine. "Bring any documentation," she advised. I did not feel like a complainer. I felt like someone reclaiming what was rightfully his. I began a different ledger, one Helen would have approved, a daily log of small betrayals, a voicemail left unanswered, a visit that coincided with a money request, a social post tagged with a furniture store. None of these entries alone would prove malice, but together they sketched a pattern of entitlement and manipulation. When the day of the bank meeting arrived, I took my notebook and the printed posts I had saved. Maria arranged statements and copies. It felt mundane and decisive. Facts, I realized, are a kind of armor. I left knowing where my money had gone and with a plan. Freeze automatic transfers until we could verify the purpose of each withdrawal. The ledger would be my new language. Bank statements my proof. Dignity and freedom would be reclaimed, not given, by steady, deliberate daily action. The call about rent had been an insult, but it had also been a clarifying moment. Instead of retreating into shame, I had turned humiliation into a blueprint for action. I would no longer be a silent provider in someone else's curated life. I would trace every dollar and reclaim my dignity. I began to see cracks in a facade I had trusted all my life. At first, the changes were small. Missed calls, polite offers to handle the bills, a gentle insistence that I rest while they did the paperwork. Walker and Gianna were always smiling, always acting devoted. I wanted to trust them. I still loved my son. But trust, I would learn, can be weaponized. Their kindness came on schedule. Casseroles at my door, cheerful help with chores, and texts that read, "Don't worry, Dad. We have it covered." Behind that kindness, a quiet campaign began. Gianna took charge of my mail and asked where statements should be filed. Walker made helpful comments about saving money by consolidating accounts. Each request was framed as care. Words like manipulation, entitlement, and greed did not mean much to me then. Soon they would. They were good actors. At the coffee shop, they cooed about concern for my appetite. When Owen suggested I check my investments, Gianna dismissed him as overly anxious. Cooper from the golf club noticed unopened envelopes. Walker explained I'd asked them to sort things. No alarm bells. Who expects betrayal wrapped in help? Gradually, their suggestions eroded my confidence. I had always managed my affairs. Paid the mortgage, balanced checks, kept meticulous records. But they began to suggest I was forgetful and sentimental. "You worry about the past," Gianna said, touching my arm. "Let us take the little things so you can enjoy life." Her voice sounded kind, but the subtext was clear. Let us control them. They asked about my insurance over dinner. Why keep paying redundant plans? Walker said, "If we consolidate, we can reduce your monthly expenses." I told him the policies were Helen's idea. He nodded sympathetically. "Just think about simplifying," he said. The repetition of easier lulled me. Convenience was bait. They began to manage my pharmacist refills and medical appointments, suggesting I stop driving at night for safety. "Dad, it's not safe." "We'll take you," Gianna said, then added, "It would be better if we handled the bank calls too." It felt sensible. One afternoon, Gianna presented a stack of papers called bank updates. Forms to sign, routine authorizations, she explained, so they could pay bills when I traveled. "This just makes things simpler," she said. Walker hovered, nodding. "Dad, we just want to protect you from missed payments," he said. I hesitated. Walker's voice sounded steady. He was my son. Would I deny him trust? After signing, relief washed over me. I told myself I was delegating menial tasks sensibly. I felt lighter. They thanked me. Gianna hugged me and whispered, "You can count on us." Their gratitude felt warm, but there was expectation beneath it. Landscapes of control are built slowly. Little conveniences became habit. They scheduled appointments, intercepted mail, answered calls in my name. My signature, once private, began appearing on documents I hadn't read fully. At dinners, Walker steered conversation to finances, mentioning how costly long-term care could be and how vital it was to get affairs in order. Gianna showed articles about elder fraud, feigning concern and then suggesting safeguards. One day Walker pitched joint management as a loving safeguard. "If we set up joint access, you'll never worry about missed payments," he said. Framed as love, the idea bewildered me. Love, I thought, protected, not possessed. Their pitch sounded like devotion. It was a step toward turning affection into entitlement. When Mr. Waylon Gray, a lawyer they knew, appeared in my living room, I grew uneasy. He asked about investments and property and suggested updating my will to reflect current family needs. His legal language sounded like care, but it made me uncomfortable. He took notes as if arranging my affairs. Something in me resisted. That night, alone with Helen's photograph on the mantel, I felt a chill. I had given my savings to protect my son, but their care felt like a plan. I had to remember that betrayal could be polite, that humiliation often arrived disguised as mercy. I needed to pay attention. Greed, left unchecked, grows like vines around what you love. As weeks passed, their interest grew bolder. Walker began asking unnecessary questions about beneficiaries and policy names, casually querying, "So who's on the life insurance?" As if curious. Gianna would pat his hand and say, "Checking. We should ensure everything is in order." Their casual tone masked intent. Once, a pharmacist mentioned someone had phoned asking about my prescriptions. A neighbor later told me a man in a suit had been seen near my front gate. I felt myself shrinking inside my own house. When I cleared my throat to speak, Walker interrupted with a lesson on market volatility, steering me away from questions. He used phrases like "simplify your estate" and "avoid future complications," always wrapping control in concern. Owen stopped dropping by unannounced, saying he didn't want to create tension. Cooper glanced at Walker and muttered that something felt off. Despite their smiles, an urge to reclaim my autonomy grew. I began keeping a tighter hold on envelopes and declined Gianna's offers to help with lists. She feigned hurt, but embarrassment was preferable to being cornered. I decided to watch and learn. Trust is not signatures. It is honesty. I would not hand over my peace. I began keeping a private ledger, noting every call, visit, and unexpected expense carefully. The morning the forgery became a real threat, I woke with a hollow feeling I could not ignore. After weeks of their small intrusions, steering conversations, intercepting envelopes, scheduling appointments, I sensed something more direct approaching. I had warned myself not to be surprised again. Still, their ease at entering my life made me vulnerable. Gianna arrived that day with a folder and a smile. "Dad," she said, "Mr. Gray wants to come by to go over some estate planning. It's housekeeping, nothing to worry about." Walker stood behind her, casual and reassuring. I hesitated but agreed to a short meeting. I remember thinking their presence made it seem harmless. Mr. Waylon Gray presented himself with polished manners. He spread papers labeled authorizations and an updated will. He spoke about simplifying affairs and avoiding future complications. "We only want to make sure your wishes are clear," he said, sliding a pen toward me. Walker added comforts about reducing taxes and easing burdens. Their language felt protective. I signed. Later, as the house grew quiet, unease settled in. I asked Maria at the bank to pull my existing will and beneficiary records. She compared files and frowned. There it was, an updated will filed under my lawyer's name that I had never authorized. The signature on that document matched writing I had been coaxed into placing on other forms. I felt stupid and furious in the same breath. Confronting Walker that evening, his denials came quickly. "Dad, a clerical error," he said. Gianna feigned concern. Their performance was practiced. I called my lawyer, Mr. Jackson, who told me to bring all documents and say nothing to them. "We'll need evidence," he said. "If it's forged, we'll expose it." The next days were methodical. Jackson subpoenaed filing records and asked the courthouse clerk for copies. He requested handwriting analysis and had the bank freeze any transfers tied to the suspect will. As the evidence gathered, their pattern revealed itself. They had used my signed authorizations to create an appearance of consent, then filed a forged document to seize control. Betrayal is peculiar. It makes you remeasure every small kindness. I discovered papers with my name tucked into envelopes I never opened. Walker had been placing my signature on forms when I trusted him to help. Their tactic was simple. Create trust, then convert it into control. They went further, trying to fashion a narrative that I was declining. Gianna spoke to neighbors about my confusion, and Walker told casual acquaintances I was forgetful. Their efforts to damage my reputation were deliberate. But reputation is brittle under scrutiny. Witnesses who knew me, Owen, Cooper, friends from the golf club, offered statements about my clarity, my independence, and the way I managed daily affairs. Maria at the bank compared signatures and confirmed inconsistencies. A chilling detail emerged. The forged will named them primary heirs and included clauses transferring property and access to funds. The document was tailored to leave them nearly everything. Their curiosity about life insurance beneficiaries suddenly had teeth. It was not idle interest but design. I thought of Helen's letter, her warning to guard our savings. The forged will made that warning a call to action. I would protect what remained of our life together. When Jackson laid out the evidence, I felt calm resolve. There was no dramatic shouting. I presented facts. The filing number, comparison of signatures, bank holds, and witness affidavits. Facing data and testimony, Walker's composure cracked. Gianna's practiced concern faded. There was no denying the trail. Legal machinery began to turn. The clerk at the courthouse acknowledged irregularities with the filing. Handwriting analysts noted differences. The bank maintained holds. An inquiry into the forged document opened. The will was challenged, and the forgery was exposed for what it was. Not a mistake but a deliberate attempt to reassign the life Helen and I had built. I watched their smaller strategies like choreography. Walker charm neighbors. Gianna circulate care lists as proof of devotion. With evidence, the acts looked less like affection and more like premeditation. The betrayal revealed who they were and who remained loyal. Maria's diligence, Owen's honesty, and Jackson's rigor became my scaffolding. I remember when Walker's face drained of color as evidence piled up. Stamped filings, analysis reports, bank holds, neighbor affidavits. He stammered, then grew silent. Gianna searched for a script that would save them and found none. The prosecutor's office began asking questions and the county clerk promised a thorough review. I felt no triumph, only a cautious relief. I immediately tightened my accounts, changed passwords, and asked Maria to notify me of any unusual activity and watched. The forged will had been an attempt to steal my future. Instead, it sharpened my resolve to live honestly, to protect my dignity, and to ensure that love could not be reduced to ledger entries. I had learned to recognize the difference between help and control. I had learned to keep my own hand on the steering wheel. I noticed things that I had learned to ignore before. The polite smile that didn't reach someone's eyes, the tiny delay before a helpful hand, the artful misremembering of a fact as if rehearsed. At 71, you think you have seen the world enough to know when a storm is coming. Grief brings a silence that thins the air, and those who arrive with umbrellas often hide rainmakers in their pockets. I had been mourning Helen and believed Walker and Gianna were my shelter. It took too long before the shelter felt like a hall of mirrors. Their kindness came on schedule. Casseroles at my door, cheerful help with chores, and texts that read, "Don't worry, Dad. We have it covered." Behind that kindness a quiet campaign began. Gianna took charge of my mail and asked where statements should be filed. Walker made helpful comments about saving money by consolidating accounts. Each request was framed as care. Words like manipulation, entitlement, and greed did not mean much to me then. Soon they would. They were good actors. At the coffee shop they cooed about concern for my appetite. When Owen suggested I check my investments, Gianna dismissed him as overly anxious. Cooper from the golf club noticed unopened envelopes. Walker explained I'd asked them to sort things. No alarm bells. Who expects betrayal wrapped in help? Gradually their suggestions eroded my confidence. I had always managed my affairs. Paid the mortgage, balanced checks, kept meticulous records. But they began to suggest I was forgetful and sentimental. "You worry about the past," Gianna said, touching my arm. "Let us take the little things so you can enjoy life." Her voice sounded kind, but the subtext was clear. Let us control them. They asked about my insurance over dinner. Why keep paying redundant plans? Walker said, "If we consolidate, we can reduce your monthly expenses." I told him the policies were Helen's idea. He nodded sympathetically. "Just think about simplifying," he said. The repetition of easier lulled me. Convenience was bait. They began to manage my pharmacist refills and medical appointments, suggesting I stop driving at night for safety. "Dad, it's not safe." "We'll take you," Gianna said, then added, "It would be better if we handled the bank calls too." It felt sensible. One afternoon Gianna presented a stack of papers called bank updates. Forms to sign, routine authorizations, she explained. so they could pay bills when I traveled. This just makes things simpler, she said. Walker hovered, nodding. Dad, we just want to protect you from missed payments, he said. I hesitated. Walker's voice sounded steady. He was my son. Would I deny him trust? After signing, relief washed over me. I told myself I was delegating menial tasks sensibly. I felt lighter. They thanked me. Gianna hugged me and whispered, "You can count on us." Their gratitude felt warm, but there was expectation beneath it. Landscapes of control are built slowly. Little conveniences became habit. They scheduled appointments, intercepted mail, answered calls in my name. My signature, once private, began appearing on documents I hadn't read fully. At dinners, Walker steered conversation to finances, mentioning how costly long-term care could be and how vital it was to get affairs in order. Gianna showed articles about elder fraud, feigning concern and then suggesting safeguards. One day Walker pitched joint management as a loving safeguard. If we set up joint access, you'll never worry about missed payments, he said. Framed as love, the idea bewildered me. Love, I thought, protected, not possessed. Their pitch sounded like devotion. It was a step toward turning affection into entitlement. When Mr. Waylon Gray, a lawyer they knew, appeared in my living room, I grew uneasy. He asked about investments and property and suggested updating my will to reflect current family needs. His legal language sounded like care, but it made me uncomfortable. He took notes as if arranging my affairs. Something in me resisted. That night, alone with Helen's photograph on the mantel, I felt a chill. I had given my savings to protect my son, but their care felt like a plan. I had to remember that betrayal could be polite, that humiliation often arrived disguised as mercy. I needed to pay attention. Greed, left unchecked, grows like vines around what you love. As weeks passed, their interest grew bolder. Walker began asking unnecessary questions about beneficiaries and policy names, casually querying, "So who's on the life insurance?" As if curious. Gianna would pat his hand and say, "Checking. We should ensure everything is in order." Their casual tone masked intent. Once, a pharmacist mentioned someone had phoned asking about my prescriptions. A neighbor later told me a man in a suit had been seen near my front gate. I felt myself shrinking inside my own house. When I cleared my throat to speak, Walker interrupted with a lesson on market volatility, steering me away from questions. He used phrases like "simplify your estate" and "avoid future complications," always wrapping control in concern. Owen stopped dropping by unannounced, saying he didn't want to create tension. Cooper glanced at Walker and muttered that something felt off. Despite their smiles, an urge to reclaim my autonomy grew. I began keeping a tighter hold on envelopes and declined Gianna's offers to help with lists. She feigned hurt, but embarrassment was preferable to being cornered. I decided to watch and learn. Trust is not signatures. It is honesty. I would not hand over my peace. I began keeping a private ledger, noting every call, visit, and unexpected expense carefully. The morning I decided to act, the house felt different. Smaller, as if every room had been narrowed by secrets. I wore my old jacket, the one Helen said made me look decided. I remember thinking I would not let uncertainty govern me any longer. The lawyer's office smelled of paper and coffee and the faint dust of patience. Mr. Jackson greeted me with a firm handshake. "Bring everything you have," he said. "No detail is too small." We began there with details. He fed me lists of documents I should gather. Bank statements, canceled checks, letters, any correspondence that recorded transfers. He explained subpoenas and affidavits in clear, quiet sentences. "If they made changes, we'll find the paper trail," he said. "People who forge tend to leave crumbs." With Owen's help, I pulled old mail from drawers and boxes, found receipts tucked into envelopes, noticed postmarks that didn't match the dates I remembered. I took the ledger from my bedside and made photocopies. The act of producing copies felt like armor. Evidence converts doubt into action. Then, in a drawer behind an old stack of gardening magazines, I found an envelope I had seen before but never opened. It had Helen's handwriting across the front and the word, when, written in small letters. It had been there for years, hidden perhaps by my own hand, and yet I had never read it. My hands shook as I slit the flap. The letter inside was crisp, preserved in a way that made her words seem alive. But before I could read it in private, Jackson insisted we have it scanned and added to our evidence file. Keep everything public in the legal sense, he advised. We don't want surprises. I felt a flash of irritation. This was Helen's private voice, but I understood the strategy. As Jackson worked to subpoena records from the county clerk's office, we learned the first unmistakable fact. There was an updated will filed under my name. The clerk provided a copy. My stomach turned as I read. The document named Walker and Gianna as primary beneficiaries and included language that transferred property and assets directly to them. There was a signature on that document that looked like mine. This is impossible, I said. I didn't sign this. People can be very clever, Jackson answered. But they usually leave traces. We will have the signature analyzed and the filing reviewed. If it's forged, we'll prove it. The forensic analyst called 3 days later. He explained handwriting analysis in language that made me feel both childlike and informed. There are inconsistencies, he said. The pressure and flow of the strokes don't match someone's habitual signature. It's inconsistent with other samples. The relief I felt was immediate and sharp, like light when a blind is lifted. Someone had tried to steal the future Helen and I had built. Evidence mounted. Maria at the bank produced logs showing attempts to add signatories. The bank had flagged the attempts because my signature verification failed. The life insurance policy, when requested, showed a policy had been taken out with a considerable face value and Gianna named as beneficiary. Walker had inquired, the record suggested, before I suspected anything was wrong. The discovery of the policy was a blow that settled heavy in my chest. Life insurance is a practical thing. It's intended to help a family when money is short. But when it is taken out without consent, with a beneficiary named who stands to gain by your decline, it becomes an instrument of malice. The policy sat like an ugly question mark beside the forged will. The whole house seemed to spin. I kept replaying small conversations where Walker had casually asked about beneficiaries, and Gianna had laughed about making sure Dad was taken care of. Phrases that used to be affectionate now sounded like the ink on the forged will. Betrayal was not just about theft. It was about the redefinition of care as commerce. When we presented this evidence to the county prosecutor, the response was immediate. The prosecutor's office took the matter seriously. They opened an inquiry into elder financial exploitation. Subpoenas were issued for phone records, email logs, and bank transfers. For the first time since Helen's funeral, I felt the machinery of justice begin to move on my behalf. But the law is a slow and deliberative thing. While it moved, I had to live in the small spaces between hearings and investigations. Walker and Gianna held their faces like masks, steely and composed in public. I watched to see if they would slip. People under pressure sometimes reveal their edges. One afternoon, a neighbor, Mrs. Easton, knocked and handed me a grocery bag with a pie. She mentioned in passing that she had once been asked by Gianna if she could watch me for a few hours, just to see if I was okay. Easton confessed she had felt a little strange about the request. It seemed overzealous. Her casual comment threaded into the pattern of control I had been mapping. At night I read Jackson's emails, the redactions black across some lines. The legal team was careful. They wanted airtight evidence. My counsel planned depositions, interviews, and the sequence for revealing the forged will. We have to move deliberately, Jackson said. Panic leads to mistakes, and their lawyers will pounce. Yet even as I prepared to litigate, I kept hoping Walker might break. In the quiet of my kitchen, I considered confronting him directly, asking him why, demanding to know how he could do this. But Jackson's advice echoed. Collect, document, let the truth speak in a language courts understand. I had to balance human longing for explanation with the cold arithmetic of proof. Late one night, alone with the photocopies of bank statements, I allowed myself a private anger. Not merely at Walker and Gianna but at my own sluggishness. How had I not looked more closely? How had I let love blind me? But that anger turned to resolve. Helen's letter, the forged will, the policy. These were parts of a story that justice could retell. Then came the final discovery that altered everything. A routine background check on Walker brought files from decades earlier to light and, buried in a courthouse index, a notation of a different name. A request to the state's health department turned up a medical record that referenced a paternity test from years ago. The words landed. Walker was not my biological son. The revelation was a strange cocktail of grief and liberation. It explained some patterns, the practiced voice of entitlement, the ease with which Walker accepted gifts, and painfully, it clarified motives. Helen's foresight had saved me from continuing to confuse giving with being owed. Whether blood connected us or not, their actions were a violation. I felt ready to bring all of it into a courtroom where truth could be measured. Helen's letter had been folded so many times it wore soft creases like the lines of her face. When I finally read it straight through, alone at my kitchen table, the room seemed to tilt toward clarity. She wrote of small worries and large fears. She wrote of quiet observations that had sat in her for years. Adam, she had written, I know how you love, I know how you give. But love is not a ledger. Protect what is ours. Her voice leapt from the page like a hand reaching across time. The letter contained more than gentle admonitions. Helen had been practical, sly in her foresight. She had arranged for a sealed envelope to be opened if certain conditions arose. Unexplained changes in our accounts, people pressing for signatures, or attempts to alter hereditary documents. The conditions were met, and the envelope contained instructions and a directive to my lawyer. It also referenced a DNA test she had once ordered privately, a document she had kept as a private truth. Her handwriting, looping and intimate, explained that she had once suspected Walker's paternity and had arranged for discreet testing to protect our family from future disputes. At the time, she had hoped to shield me from raw truths. She had loved me enough to bear a worry silently. But now, the test results she had tucked away were relevant. Helen's letter asked me to use whatever she had gathered not for vengeance but to preserve my peace and ensure my dignity. If the time comes, she wrote, protect our life without malice. Reading her words cleared something inside me. Her voice steadied my anger and guided my actions. Jackson placed the letter into evidence. We prepared to use it to frame my actions as protective rather than retaliatory. With Helen's direction in hand, our legal strategy sharpened. We arranged to serve subpoenas for the life insurance policy and to retrieve various electronic logs. The more we pulled, the more threads emerged. Email access logs showed Gianna had logged into my email from their IP address multiple times. There were timestamps on evenings I remembered them visiting. The bank's fraud team confirmed the aborted attempt to add Walker as an authorized signer had a trail that led back to a phone line registered to their home. Then there was the DNA file. The sealed envelope contained a note pointing to a discreet lab that had performed a paternity test years ago. Jackson filed a motion to admit the test into evidence. When the lab's report arrived, it was clinical and devastating. Walker was not my biological son. The facts did not feel cruel in the way they might have had Helen been alive to explain them. Instead, they were a ledger of truth. Damaging, clarifying, and strangely liberating. I felt an unexpected freedom. Perhaps love is not only what you receive from blood but what you give in return. I had given Walker 2 decades of fatherhood. That history remained untouched by DNA. But the test explained some things. The ease with which Walker accepted gifts, the practiced voice of entitlement. Helen's foresight had saved me from continuing to confuse giving with being owed. In the courtroom, Helen's letter became a pillar. Jackson read excerpts aloud with a voice that kept tremor out of the room. She worried about money, he said. She worried about the way entitlements can corrupt kindness. The letter humanized my motives. It framed my decisions as those of a man trying to follow his wife's wishes, not of someone motivated by bitterness. The paternity revelation added a deeper emotional layer. Gianna's tears on the stand read like performance until cross-examination exposed contradictions in her timeline. Walker, confronted with the DNA, lost the confident air he had carried for months. He misremembered events, then snapped. You think it matters? He snapped once, defensiveness dissolving into something rawer. Blood or not, he can't just cut us out. cut you out, I thought. Their entitlement had been earning at my expense for years. The judge listened as Jackson laid out the monetary trail and Helen's recorded fears. The court heard how a man at 71 had been targeted by those he loved. The tone in the room shifted. The public script of family concern grew thin. Outside the courthouse, neighbors and friends, people who had known me for decades, brought statements. Owen and Cooper spoke of my capacity for care and competence. Maria from the bank testified to unusual logins and attempted changes. These testimonies stitched a fabric that made the claims of incompetence look textured and implausible. At a recess, I stood at the courthouse steps and felt the sun warm my face. The fight had become larger than my ego. It was about whether elder abuse could be masked as family concern. Judges and clerks who had seen many cases told Jackson privately that Helen's letter made the ethical dimension unmistakable. This was not simple squabbling over inheritance. It was premeditation. But the paternity revelation complicated things emotionally. Some in the court felt sympathy for me. Others felt shocked that a life could be built on an unspoken secret. The human heart is not a legal instrument, and the DNA did not absolve the years I had parented Walker. My love had been real and sustained. When the press came sniffing, because courts are public theater, I declined interviews. The spectacle of sorrow can be exploited. I had lost enough dignity to greedy men and women. I would not donate the rest to cameras. I wanted healing, not headlines. The courtroom drama mounted through testimony and cross-examination. Jackson methodically linked the forged will, the life insurance policy, and the attempts at account access to a narrative of exploitation. The letter and the DNA test were the keystones. They did not vindicate me entirely. They simply clarified motives, revealed deception, and tilted the scale toward justice. At night, back in my small apartment that smelled faintly of sea air, I reread Helen's letter and felt the tenderness poured into every line. Her final counsel had steered me here. I slept with less fear, knowing that I had done what she would have wanted, protecting what mattered and seeking truth without malice. After we had assembled the paper trail, I thought they might relent. People sometimes fold when faced with exposure. Instead, Walker and Gianna escalated. Their strategy shifted from subtle management to overt containment. They wanted to prove I was a liability before the law could prove their crimes. It began with small things that unsettled me. Notes left in my kitchen about medication schedules I had not asked for, suggestions that I forget to take my pills, a worried call from Gianna claiming they had observed confusion during a visit. The narrative was being woven with careful stitches. Suggest decline, then present help as the cure. I think what they feared most was the letter from Helen. It had given me a moral compass and a legal foothold. Without it, their plan looked flimsy. They needed a stronger story. So they invented one. One afternoon, Walker arrived with a social worker, a woman named Justina. She carried a folder and wore an expression meant to be both clinical and compassionate. "Mr. Brooks," she began, "we're here to conduct a wellness check. It's routine in situations where family members report concerns." I felt something like a punch in the throat. They had made the call. On what grounds? I asked. Who referred you? Your family, Justina said, eyes flicking toward Walker with practiced neutrality. They're just worried about your safety. It was shameless. They called professionals to give credibility to their story. I insisted Jackson attend any interviews. He did. When the social worker asked about my daily activities, I answered plainly. I described my walks, my bookkeeping, my volunteer sessions at the community center. I spoke of Helen and the garden we had tended together. Jackson sat beside me with quiet firmness. After the welfare visit, Gianna increased her visits, always bringing prepared meals to keep his energy up. Walker called more often, his voice earnest, asking about medications and whether I had been forgetful. The choreography felt rehearsed. Meanwhile, behind the scenes, their attorney attempted to file petitions suggesting guardianship might be necessary if I continued to resist professional help. The plan's cruelty was cold. Guardianship would give them legal control over my finances and decisions. To them, the declaration of incompetence was an escalator to their goal. They had already tried to lay a foundation in the community. neighbor gossip, a few care-focused conversations, and scattered remarks to professionals. Now they sought a legal scaffold. But I resisted. My attorney moved quickly to counter their moves. Jackson asked for independent evaluations. A psychiatrist, Dr. Ashley, conducted a thorough cognitive assessment and found me lucid. My memory intact enough for everyday function. It was not dramatic testimony. It was clinical and precise. The result undermined their narrative. Even so, they tried to manipulate medical records. We discovered inconsistencies in a supposed home health note submitted by an aide who claimed I had been confused. The aide's signature matched none we could find in any registry. The pattern was clear. Create notes, insert them into records, then use them to justify intervention. At one hearing, Gianna's lawyer presented a nursing note suggesting I had been disoriented. Jackson cross-examined the nurse, who could not corroborate the entries. When the prosecution called witnesses, an odd thing happened. Some of the people Gianna had suggested to speak on her behalf recanted or admitted to being coached. The house of cards they had built began to wobble. During discovery, Jackson subpoenaed phone records and IP logs. They showed that Gianna had logged into my email multiple times, as well as attempts to access my medical portal. The digital footprints were damning. The technician who analyzed the data explained, "It's the little things, timestamps, locations, and repeated logins outside normal hours. Patterns emerge." The digital evidence also revealed an earlier, darker tactic. Traces of a sedative prescription had been ordered under my name and filled at a pharmacy where Gianna occasionally helped by collecting my medications. The pharmacist, when asked, recalled Gianna being insistent about picking up refills. The prescription itself, later analyzed, contained suspicious authorization codes. The implication was chilling. Someone had been trying to make me appear dependent by drugging me. When I first heard this, I felt something like nausea and grief rolled into one. The idea that someone had sought to chemically diminish me was a betrayal stripped of all pretense. But we had the evidence. The pharmacist's notes, the prescription history, the anonymized logs. They painted a picture that was ugly and precise. The prosecution widened their inquiry into elder abuse and fraud. They issued subpoenas for records of the life insurance application and for any communications concerning it. The more we uncovered, the more the narrative of manipulation hardened into a case. Yet I also felt sorrow for Walker. In private moments, I would recall the little boy who loved baseball, who called me Dad, wide-eyed and earnest. Now he had become a man who had chosen greed over gratitude. That dissonance did not stop me from pushing for justice. If anything, it made my resolve more melancholy than vindictive. As testimony accumulated, the social worker who had made the first visit admitted she had not observed significant signs of decline. When asked why she had come, she said she had been told the family was concerned. The prosecutor pressed the point. Concern manufactured to create advantage is itself criminal when it targets a vulnerable elder. Our case advanced. The judge issued temporary protective orders that limited Walker and Gianna's access to my accounts. The bank placed holds on transfers and required dual authorization for certain changes. For the first time in months, I slept without the immediate edge of dread. The legal system had responded. Walking home after court, I felt both exhausted and oddly lighter. The fight had required me to be watchful, to document, to call witnesses, and to translate everyday betrayals into traceable acts. It was painful labor. But the key was this: manipulation thrives in secrecy and shame. Exposure makes it difficult to sustain. When I woke up in the hospital, the room smelled like antiseptic and lemon. The clock on the wall blinked small and indifferent. I remember a nurse saying, "He missed a dose and collapsed," and someone mentioning falls and low blood pressure. My first thought, the one that unspooled before memory returned, was Helen. How she'd scold me for leaving the garden gate open. The second was this odd hollow. Who had changed the script of my life? My doctor, calm and efficient, explained the tests. My blood work showed abnormally high levels of a benzodiazepine, an anxiety medication I had never been prescribed. He raised his eyebrows and said, "This doesn't belong in your system, Mr. Brooks." I listened as if I were hearing someone else describe a stranger. The nurse handed me a printout. Pharmacy logs, timestamps, and notes. My hands trembled as I read. At first I suspected an error. Pharmacies make mistakes. I've seen mislabeling, wrong dosages. But the printouts matched what Jackson and the prosecution had suspected. A prescription had been filled in my name with authorizations that didn't make sense. The pharmacy surveillance footage, when subpoenaed, showed Gianna entering the store more frequently than she had admitted. The tapes were grainy, the faces indistinct, but the pattern was plain. Someone had been obtaining medications in ways that suggested intent. When the hospital discharged me, I felt unmoored. The doctors advised rest. Jackson insisted on further investigation. We need to tie the physical evidence to the larger pattern, he said. And tie it we did. The pharmacy records, cross-referenced with bank withdrawals and emails, made a chain of actions that bound the sedative incident to the broader scheme of influence. Gianna's face on the stand had been smooth, rehearsed. But the grainy footage, the altered prescriptions, and the pharmacist's admission that Gianna had been particularly insistent about picking up refills undermined her performance. The court adjourned as new evidence was added to the docket. What started as accusations of forgery and theft now reached into a darker territory of attempted incapacitation. The prosecutor's office expanded their inquiries accordingly. Friends visited, bringing casseroles and condolences wrapped in paper plates. Owen held my hand and said nothing. His presence was a kind of prayer. Cooper shook a fist at the thought. My garden club called to offer statements. The community rallied in ways that both warmed and surprised me. People who had known me for decades said things like, "We know Adam. He'd never lose himself like that." The simplest testimonies, about my regular bowling nights or my volunteer work, resembled alibis of normalcy. In court, the prosecution laid out the sequence. Attempts to add signatories, forged will, covert life insurance, email access from their IP, and now pharmacy records showing suspicious prescriptions. The narrative had coherence. Opportunistic greed escalating into a plan to manufacture infirmity. The judge listened, expression unreadable. Under cross-examination, Gianna's story faltered. When asked why she had picked up certain medications, she shifted, then invoked vague concerns about helping. Walker tried to maintain composure, but when confronted with timestamps that showed him at home when he claimed not to be, his face reddened. The ability to ignore evidence dissolves when evidence is precise. At one point, the prosecutor played a snippet from surveillance footage. Just a few seconds of Gianna handing a prescription slip to a clerk. The clip's simplicity was devastating. It wasn't cinematic. It was domestic and terrible. It made what had been whispered in the kitchen loud in the courtroom. The defense's attempts to reframe actions as familial concern rang hollow. The judge ordered an independent review of my medical records and pharmacy transactions. A special investigator was appointed to look into potential elder abuse and attempted fraud. For the first time, I felt the full weight of institutional attention slide onto the perpetrator's shoulders. But the emotional work was harder than legal maneuvers. I had to reconcile memories of Walker as a child with a man who now walked into court in a pressed suit and lied under oath. I had to forgive myself for missed signals and for not seeing early warning signs. Forgiveness, I found, is not the same as forgetting. It is a way to move with dignity despite pain. At night, lying on the narrow couch in my attorney's office while legal papers sprawled around, I thought of Helen's letter again, the admonition to protect our life together. The drugging attempt crystallized the stakes in a way no ledger could. This was about bodily autonomy and the right to remain oneself. The law's reach into such intimate betrayals felt both necessary and imperfect. When the media caught wind of the sedative evidence, the story nudged public sympathy in my direction. But headlines reduced nuance. They suggested a villain and a victim and left out the slow gaslighting that had come before. I wanted people to understand the way manipulation grows in small gestures. A cooked meal too often, a concerned note that multiplies, a hand that reaches for your keys when you do not offer them. Walker and Gianna's world narrowed. As the investigation tightened, they made mistakes. They texted about money in unguarded tones. They argued about whether to sell a piece of furniture quickly. Those messages, pulled into evidence, showed panic and opportunism. The digital trail was ruthless in its truthfulness. I did not dance in triumph when arrests were made. The legal process was not a spectacle for my satisfaction. It was a means to safety. When Walker was arrested, I felt sorrow. When Gianna was taken in for questioning, her eyes searched mine as if seeking forgiveness. I had none to give that would excuse what had been done. Weeks later, when the prosecutor spoke of charges, I heard words like elder abuse and attempted fraud. The law had named what my heart had long suspected. The indictment did not heal the past, but it secured a future in which I would not be prey. Afterward, back in my apartment, I planted seeds in small pots on my windowsill. The act felt modest and defiant. Each sprout was a thing that grew under my own care. I had been stripped of trust, but not of the capacity to cultivate. The drugging had been the most piercing betrayal, but it had also clarified what I would fight to protect. My mind, my independence, and the quiet dignity Helen had urged me to safeguard. At 71, I had learned that freedom demands vigilance. The court would do its work. I would do mine. I remember the day the law stopped sounding like a distant bell and felt like a steady hand. After the hospital episode and the evidence Jackson assembled, the prosecutor opened an inquiry labeled plainly, Elder Financial Exploitation. Reading that phrase on a court document made me feel less alone. It gave a name to the humiliation and manipulation I had endured. We met the prosecutor in a small conference room. She was matter-of-fact and direct. "We need a pattern of intent," she said. "Not mistakes, premeditation." Jackson nodded and outlined what we had: a forged will, bank logs showing odd access, emails from Gianna to a notary, pharmacy records with suspicious refills, and the life insurance application naming Gianna as beneficiary. The dossier felt like a map that finally led somewhere. Investigators moved quietly but efficiently. Subpoenas were sent for phone records and IP logs. Forensic handwriting analysis was ordered. The bank's fraud team reviewed attempts to add signatories. The pharmacy cooperated. I watched as professionals translated betrayal into facts. Where emotions had clouded judgment, evidence cleared a path. One finding chilled me. The forged will had been filed through an online filing service using credentials traced to Gianna's IP address. The handwriting analyst reported mismatched pressure and flow compared with my known signature. The life insurance application bore timing that matched a season when I had been especially tired, an interval Gianna often visited. Each detail tightened the narrative of exploitation. Still, the prosecutor warned that proving intent required patience. "We must avoid theatrics," she said. "This is family matters and community reputations." I wanted justice without spectacle. Jackson built the case like a craftsman, careful to put each piece where it could not be dislodged. Walker and Gianna reacted as you might expect when cornered. They withdrew in public and tested in private. Their lawyer began arguing procedure while probing for vulnerabilities in our story. It felt like a chess match where we had to avoid hasty moves. My friends rallied. Owen and Cooper wrote affidavits attesting to my routines. Volunteer days, morning walks, community activities that showed competence rather than decline. Maria at the bank produced logs and her observations about unusual online accesses. Simple testimonies became anchors of credibility. Investigators also turned up emails where Gianna discussed timing and expedited processing with a notary. The tone was transactional. When combined with pharmacy logs showing repeated refills collected by a person tied to Gianna's household, and with bank logs indicating attempted signatory changes, a troubling pattern appeared. Small acts of convenience that together constituted a campaign of control. There were setbacks. Some neighbors hesitated to testify, and a social worker who initially seemed sympathetic recanted parts of an account. The defense aimed to muddy waters with claims of misinterpretation. Courts respect doubt. Doubt slows progress. But where doubt was sown, the careful documentation we had gathered dispelled it. When the preliminary hearing convened, the judge listened as attorneys sparred over admissibility. Jackson presented affidavits. The prosecution outlined the case theory. The defense claimed family misunderstanding. The judge allowed key evidence and set a timetable. The county then filed formal charges: will forgery, attempted fraud, and elder financial exploitation, with the sedative matter forwarded for further inquiry. That indictment did not erase pain, but it turned private humiliation into public accountability. It signaled that manipulation disguised as family care would be tested under law. I felt a cautious relief. My dignity mattered to more than just me. The life insurance detail haunted me. Investigators found an application for a substantial policy, $500,000, with Gianna listed as beneficiary. Seeing that number on a document felt like a cold confirmation of motive. It transformed whispered greed into a tangible goal. The prosecutor emphasized how a pattern of small seizures of control can lead to large, predatory outcomes. Each time an investigator confirmed a login or a refill, my shock softened into resolve. I had been targeted, and the law was now the instrument to respond. At night, with court files stacked beside Helen's photograph, I wrote a short note to her. The legal process was sterile and slow, but it confirmed a truth Helen had always felt, that protecting what we built together mattered. The law was now a tool to secure the life she and I had made, to make sure greed could not hide behind love. I would soon learn that justice moves in steps. Evidence had to be vetted, witnesses prepared, and narratives tested. The work of proof requires patience and tenacity, and I had both in new supply. For months afterward, investigators continued to pull at threads, and each tug revealed another small truth about the scale of their manipulation. I was ready to watch those threads be woven into a case that could not be unmade. The first day of trial carried a weight I had not expected. The courtroom felt like a quiet machine meant to render facts visible. I sat and watched faces, some familiar, some official, while the judge called the case. The prosecutor opened with a statement that traced a line from small manipulations to a scheme. Forged documents, repeated account intrusions, pharmacy irregularities, and a life insurance application with Gianna named as beneficiary. The defense painted a competing story of family confusion and miscommunication. Their words were polished. The hard documents were waiting. When I was called, I rose with a ledger folded in my pocket. Jackson had insisted I bring the numbers. Rent amounts, gifts, transfers, dates and amounts photocopied and organized. On the stand, my voice felt both private and public as I recounted details. The wedding photos I had not been invited to, the tuxedo hanging unused, the repeated calls for help that had ended in direct withdrawals and requests. I spoke plainly about humiliation and the slow accumulation of entitlement. The defense attorney aimed to show that confusion and misremembered dates explained discrepancies. He asked about specifics, account numbers, dates I had signed forms, and attempted to frame normal mistakes as evidence of decline. I answered with the ledger and with memory. Numbers are stubborn things. They refuse the softness of plausible deniability. Witness testimony followed. Maria from the bank described logins flagged as abnormal and attempts to add signatories that the bank had blocked. Her calm testimony held small technical details that, when stitched together, suggested intent rather than accident. The handwriting analyst explained pressure, pen angle, and stroke patterns that did not match my known signature. Those technicalities felt mundane until they spoke to a core truth. Forgery involves intention. The pharmacist testified to irregular refill patterns and to a person who frequently picked up medications on my behalf. His attention to dates made the episode of sedation feel less like a fluke and more like part of an orchestrated effort. The prosecutor played snippets of emails. Gianna arranging expedited filings with a notary, texts between Walker and Gianna about selling items and getting things in our name. The emails and texts carried a transactional tone that clashed with their earlier public concern. Gianna took the stand and presented a rehearsed concern for my welfare. She said she only wanted to help. Under Jackson's cross-examination, the rehearsed edges frayed. He produced server logs showing her IP logging into my email at odd hours and timestamps matching times I did not authorize activity. He confronted her with emails where she discussed timing and logistics in a way that read like a plan. Her eyes darted. Her answers grew thin. Walker's testimony was uneven. Sometimes defensive, sometimes evasive. He tried to reconcile the language of care with actions that the paper trail exposed. The DNA revelation hovered, irrelevant to criminality but revealing about relational motives. It clarified that Walker's filial ties had been shaped by choice rather than biology, which complicated sympathy but did not excuse behavior. Throughout, I felt a strange mixture of grief and clarity. Testimony dredged up memories I treasured, Sundays at the park, nights coaching Little League, and those memories felt at odds with the ledger. But the legal burden was to translate memory into medicated evidence. Jackson and the prosecution turned recollection into admissible facts. The defense called witnesses who suggested I was more forgetful than I seemed. But Owen and the men from the golf club recounted routines that demonstrated competence. Volunteer hours, scheduled walks, social engagements. Their testimony was steady. It helped show I was not a victim of dementia but of opportunistic exploitation. When the day wound down, Jackson's closing that afternoon was not theatrical but incisive. He read Helen's letter aloud, its lines cutting through defenses of plausible care, and tied motive to method. A letter of concern, a forged will, a secret of policy, and a pattern of access. The prosecutor urged the jury to look beyond the soft language of concern into the hard paper trail of greed. The courtroom's gravity reached beyond facts. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones and reporters took notes. Jurors shifted as the pattern of emails and refills unfolded. I felt exposed but not alone. Community scrutiny, while painful, affirmed that dignity deserved defense. I trusted that facts would prevail and restore a measure of dignity now. Gianna's cross-examination was the moment facts began to wedge open the practiced performance she had cultivated. She sat with composure and spoke of concern, of watching over me and ensuring my safety. On the stand she sounded sincere, until Jackson began to pinpoint timestamps and electronic footprints that did not align with a simple story of care. He asked about her email access to my account. I checked in, she said, voice steady. Jackson produced server logs showing repeated access from her IP at odd hours and dates I did not authorize. The data was clinical and unforgiving. Gianna's explanations frayed under pressure. When Jackson asked why she corresponded with a notary about expedited filings, her tone shifted. The notary's replies were businesslike. Questions about timing, digital signatures, and logistics. The emails read transactional, not familial. Then came the life insurance matter. The prosecutor introduced the policy application, an amount substantial enough to alter someone's motives. Gianna claimed she had been helping secure coverage, but the paper trail revealed she had been listed as beneficiary and had inquired about timing. When told that the policy had been applied for during a period I remembered as especially vulnerable, her composure wavered. Facts have a way of making discomfort tell a story. We also played audio evidence, recordings of conversations Gianna had with a friend in which she spoke candidly about getting accounts sorted, and joked about keeping sentimental dollars out of the way. Listening to that recorded voice in a public space was like watching her strip excuses like layers of clothing. The casualness of her words, juxtaposed with official filings and emails, converted suspicion into a coherent pattern. Walker's testimony came later and was more strained. He oscillated between defense and avoidance, sometimes protective, sometimes evasive. He tried to distance himself from decisions, claiming ignorance, and at other moments he defended actions as kindness. The DNA revelation hovered in the background. It did not excuse behavior, but it complicated motives. Knowing Walker was not my biological son clarified that filial obligation had been shaped by choice and habit, not blood, which made his betrayal all the more painful. Text messages surfaced. Plain strings that read like shopping lists for acquisition. Discussions about selling furniture, consolidating accounts, and getting things in our name appeared blunt and practical. The defense said they were pragmatic family talk. The tone, however, was hard to reconcile with innocence. Under mounting pressure, Gianna alternated between anger, tears, and a brittle attempt at apology. She offered that she had only wanted to keep me safe. But actions, not intentions, form negligence and criminality. The judge observed that the discrepancy between claimed motives and documented acts invited scrutiny. Jackson linked emails, notary correspondence, pharmacy logs, and the forged will into a narrative of intent. The jury watched as a mosaic appeared. Small acts of convenience positioned to produce big gains. The defense's attempts to explain away the pattern grew thin. There were moments of sorrow. Watching Walker shift from the boy who once asked about catching a ball into a man who discussed assets made me grieve. I thought of Sundays at the park and nights when he listened to Helen read aloud. Those memories did not cancel the ledger, but they complicated my heart. That evening, walking back to my small apartment, I felt empty and relieved, truly. The legal work had turned private humiliation into public record. The law could not restore the past, but it could prevent similar tragedies for others. When the jury returned and read guilty on will forgery, attempted fraud, and elder financial exploitation, a slow settling filled me. It was not triumph, but a correction to a wrong that had been allowed to grow. Additional inquiries followed into the sedative evidence, and Walker and Gianna were detained. Watching them go brought hollow relief. Abuse should not be sheltered. Civil remedies followed. The forged will was invalidated, transfers reversed, the insurance voided, and restitution ordered. The bank instituted protections that restored financial independence I had feared lost. In practical terms, measures secured my accounts and prevented further manipulation. Public reactions varied. Some neighbors expressed quiet support. Others withdrew, unsure how to face the awkwardness of betrayal revealed publicly. In the garden club, faces that had been polite functions became genuine sources of comfort. Owen brought steady presence. Cooper made dinners and reminded me of ordinary things. Those small acts of community mended parts of the fabric I'd felt torn. I chose to sell the house not to punish but to detach from a geography that held too many etched memories. Moving to a modest apartment near the water felt like making a deliberate space for recovery. I bought watercolor paints and began to paint again. Small canvases of light and windows. The act felt like reclamation, replacing ledgers with color. Part of the court's orders included restrictions on contact and counseling requirements for the defendants. The judge emphasized restitution and supervised contact if future interactions occurred. Whether those measures would change Walker and Gianna was uncertain, but the law had made a boundary to protect me. I reinvested part of the restored funds into causes Helen had cared about. Elder advocacy, legal aid, and a small scholarship in her name at the community college. Donating felt like reclaiming generosity for public good. I also started volunteering at the Elder Center, teaching workshops on financial safeguards and sharing practical tips about spotting coercion. The work softened my days and made my experience useful to others. There were practical adjustments. New passwords, dual signature requirements, and bank alerts. Maria helped set up safeguards that felt like sensible armor. Walker filed appeals that prolonged the legal strain. I endured delays with patience and a determination not to be hollowed by the process. When restitution arrived, the relief was concrete yet muted. Money had been a weapon and was now disarmed, but trust had been eroded. Rebuilding meant small acts, lists, receipts, and refusing to cede control without transparency. The verdict changed my future's landscape. It did not erase pain but established guardrails. I painted the harbor that week and, for the first time in a long while, finished a scene without erasing lines. That felt like a small victory in a life reshaped by both loss and recovery. I kept tending the small things and found dignity in that practice very much. The last chapter of public reckoning closed, but a quieter one opened inside me. I often think of Helen when dawn leaks across the curtains. I can almost hear the rustle of her voice telling me to be kind to myself. The years had taught me to be generous, sometimes to a fault. The experience taught me to keep a firmer hand on my life and, oddly, to keep compassion for myself and even for Walker. On Sundays I visit Helen's grave and read from the letter she left. People ask if revenge tempted me. The truth is simple. I never wanted revenge. I wanted clarity, dignity, and the right to live my last years with autonomy. Helen's words, "Love cannot survive when it is measured in dollars," became a lantern. Her counsel nudged every choice I made after the betrayal. In the apartment I filled small spaces with comforting things. A kettle that sang, a shelf of novels, and an easel with paints where watercolor pans looked like tiny islands. I began to write letters to friends about small days, walks, meals, and the odd things that still made me laugh. Sometimes I wrote to Walker, words I never mailed. Forgiveness is a work that often asks for time, and accountability must come before trust returns. Community became my tether. The Elder Center welcomed me as a speaker and teacher. I turned my story into practical advice about passwords, verification, and watching for coercion. People listened with the attention experience gives. Helping others feel safer felt like a new vocation. I also formalized the small fund to help elders hire a lawyer quickly. Call it a safety net. Its first beneficiary was a woman who had been coerced by her nephew. Seeing her regain control felt like a private victory. Each small act nudged my life toward purpose and away from bitterness. Occasionally, Walker sent brief messages. I read them and did not reply. Some bridges can be repaired. Others require slow, demonstrable change. I wanted accountability more than contact. Trust must be rebuilt piece by piece. I plant geraniums in a window box and water them each morning. I walk to the lighthouse and watch the beam cut through gray skies, and sometimes a woman on the bench will tell me about a watercolor she finished. We exchange small, companionable observations about light. It is in those ordinary details that I find recovery. I keep Helen's letter folded in my wallet. On quiet nights I read it beneath the lamplight and whisper my thanks. The story I tell now is not of bitterness but of survival, clarity, and the slow reclaiming of joy. I had given too much for love. Now I give with intention. That, more than restitution, feels like freedom. If you stayed with me this far, thank you. I need your head and your heart for this one. I'm Adam, and before we close I want to ask you the same hard questions I kept asking myself through every twist of this story. Would you have seen the manipulation if it arrived wrapped in casseroles and cheerful texts? When the people you love begin to treat you like a bank, how do you protect your dignity without cutting off your own heart? If a lawyer slid a pen across the table and asked you to sign just a form, would you pause or trust? If the DNA in a file told you someone you raised wasn't your blood, would that change your definition of family or your sense of self-worth? Could you forgive someone who tried to drug you into silence? Or is justice the only answer that preserves freedom? What would you do first? Call a lawyer, lock your accounts, or confront them face to face? Drop your thoughts below. Be brutal, be tender, be honest. Share one moment in this story that hit you hardest. The wedding exclusion, the forged will, the life insurance shock, Helen's letter, or the courtroom reveal. Use the comments to share your take on betrayal, greed, resilience, and how we guard our elders. If you want more real, twist-packed stories like mine, stories about reclaiming dignity and fighting manipulation, subscribe now and ring the bell. Your voice matters here. Tell me, would you have done the same?